Title: The House of Whispers. Chapter 1: The Invitation. The wind howled through the hills as Eliza turned the key in the rusted lock of the old iron gate. It creaked loudly, a protesting sound that made her skin crawl. The house stood at the end of a long, narrow road, hidden deep within a dense forest of twisted oaks. The trees bent with a peculiar slant, as if bowing toward the mansion, as if it were a thing of reverence, or perhaps fear. Eliza had never seen a house quite like it. The stone walls, dark and imposing, seemed to devour the light around them. Ivy crawled up the facade, intertwining with the windows, its tendrils gripping like fingers. The structure seemed alive, breathing through the cracks in its ancient stonework. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. This was the place, the house her late aunt had left to her in her will. But it wasn't just the house itself that troubled Eliza. It was the legend that surrounded it. The stories that had been whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk. Tales of strange disappearances, mysterious happenings, and of a place where time itself seemed to warp. She had ignored all those warnings at first, as anyone would. She had never believed in such things. Yet, here she was, standing at the gates of a place she knew she shouldn't be. Eliza's heart beat faster as she stepped through the gate, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. The house loomed closer, growing larger and more imposing with every step. It felt as if it were watching her, waiting for her to make the mistake of entering. "Just get inside," she muttered to herself, shaking off the unease that clung to her like a second skin. The door to the mansion was just as ancient as the rest of the house, a solid piece of oak that seemed to resist her touch. She reached for the brass handle, its surface tarnished by time. As she pushed the door open, a cold gust of air rushed out, brushing against her face like an unseen hand. The house seemed to breathe in time with her, the floorboards groaning under her weight, as if they had not borne the burden of a living soul for far too long. Inside, the air was thick with dust and neglect. The furniture was draped in white sheets, their shapes distorted, like ghosts of past lives. Cobwebs clung to every corner, their delicate threads shimmering in the weak light that filtered through the dirty windows. The silence in the house was absolute, a silence so deep it felt almost unnatural, as though the house itself had ceased to speak long ago. Eliza shook off the unsettling feeling and stepped further inside. Her footsteps echoed through the grand hallway, a hollow sound that reverberated off the walls, amplifying her isolation. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their eyes following her as she moved past them. The faces in the paintings were strange, not quite human. The eyes, too large, too dark, seemed to peer into her very soul, making her skin crawl. As Eliza wandered through the house, she couldn't help but feel an odd sensation of déjà vu. It was as if she had been here before, though she knew she never had. The layout of the rooms seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, as if the house had a life of its own, one that existed just beneath the surface, hidden from view. She found her way into the drawing room, where the fireplace had long since gone cold. The smell of mildew and decay lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of something floral, almost sweet, yet far too faint to identify. There was an old piano in the corner, its keys yellowed and cracked. Eliza approached it, her fingers brushing the dust-covered surface. As she touched the piano, the air seemed to change, the room growing colder, a noise, faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. Eliza froze, her hand still resting on the piano. She listened, straining to hear the source of the sound. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the house, somewhere beneath her feet. A hollow tapping noise, like fingernails against wood. Suddenly, there was a sharp, sudden creak from the floor above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The house was supposed to be empty. The will had been clear. Her aunt had lived alone here, had passed alone. So who? She stood there for a moment, paralyzed, staring at the staircase that led up into the darkened second floor. The tapping stopped. The footsteps had faded. It was as if the house was holding its breath. "Maybe just the house settling," she whispered, trying to calm herself. "You're being ridiculous, Eliza." But the chill in the air remained. It seemed to seep into her bones, gnawing at her from the inside. She turned back to the piano, trying to distract herself. As her fingers hovered over the keys, a single note played. It was low, heavy, and sustained for far too long, as if the piano itself were breathing. Eliza pulled her hand away, startled. She could have sworn that the note had come from the very depths of the piano, as if it had been played by unseen hands. Her pulse quickened. She needed to get a grip. There were no ghosts here, no spirits lingering in the shadows. It was just an old house, and she had to make it her own. But even as she told herself this, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, that something was waiting in the darkness. The house itself seemed to be alive, aware of her presence, aware of her fear. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the cracked windows felt like a deliberate touch, a message, a warning. Eliza walked away from the piano and toward the grand staircase, her every step echoing in the silence. The stairs were worn, their edges smooth from years of use. As she reached the top, she saw the hallway stretch before her, leading to rooms she had yet to explore. The whispers from earlier, those soft, haunting whispers, seemed to hum just beneath the surface of the walls. She could almost hear her name in the sound, a faint breath that slid across her skin. Eliza. The wind seemed to whisper, though the house was still. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure if the voice was real or if it was her imagination, but it made her blood run cold. She shook her head, determined to ignore the feeling. There was no one here, no one to haunt her. It was just an old house, just an old house. But the whispers wouldn't stop. In the middle of the hallway, a door stood ajar. Eliza hesitated before pushing it open, half expecting to see something, or someone, on the other side. But there was nothing. The room beyond was dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut against the light. The furniture in the room was shrouded in white cloths, just like the rest of the house. It was then that she noticed it. A small, ornate box sitting atop a dresser. She approached it slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for the lid. The box was carved with intricate designs, patterns she didn't recognize, yet they seemed familiar in a way she couldn't place. The moment her fingers touched the surface of the box, a chill ran up her spine, and the whispers grew louder. Opening the box revealed a faded photograph. It was an old, sepia-toned picture of a woman. Her aunt, Eliza realized, but much younger, standing beside a man she didn't recognize. The man's face was blurred, as if the camera had been unable to capture his features clearly. But the look in her aunt's eyes was unmistakable. Her gaze was empty, hollow, as if she were staring into a void, a place far beyond the living. Eliza felt her stomach twist. She turned the photo over and scrawled in the corner was a single word. Help. A sudden wave of dread washed over her. The room seemed to close in around her, and for the first time, she felt truly alone in the house. The whispers were now louder, echoing through the walls, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. The temperature dropped even further, and Eliza could see her breath fogging in the air. Help, she whispered, the words seeming to resonate with something deep inside her, something that felt ancient, that had been waiting for her. She wasn't alone here. Not anymore. Chapter 1. Continued. Eliza's fingers trembled as she slowly placed the photograph back into the box, the unsettling sense of cold dread enveloping her like a thick, suffocating blanket. The whispers that had once been a mere whispering thread had now become a cacophony of voices, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to bounce off the walls, weaving through the corners of the room like invisible hands. Help! The word hung in the air, still and haunting. Eliza's gaze snapped back to the photograph. The coldness in her chest grew, as if something deep within the house was pulling at her, urging her to stay, to search deeper. But the fear, that raw primal fear, pushed her forward. Not now, she whispered to herself. You're just tired. This is just a dream. But the air was thick with a sense of presence. A presence she could not explain, but that her every instinct screamed at her to avoid. Her heart thudded against her ribs, the sound loud in her ears, drowning out the whispers. The room felt suffocating, closing in on her with every passing second. She turned toward the door, But before she could take a step, the house groaned. A deep, throaty sound that came from somewhere beneath her feet. The very foundation of the mansion seemed to shudder, a tremor running through the walls. Her breath caught in her throat and her pulse spiked as the temperature around her plummeted further. The cold had become unbearable, like fingers of frost crawling under her skin. A low, distant thud echoed from above. Eliza froze, her blood running cold. She wasn't alone. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The footsteps were real. Someone, or something, was walking above her, pacing the floor as if it were following her every move. Her legs were frozen, her body caught in place as the footsteps grew louder, closer, like someone was descending from the attic, step by deliberate step, approaching her. Each thud made her pulse race faster, the air growing heavier with every passing moment. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of there, but her body refused to obey. She took a slow, shallow breath, trying to steady herself. She turned toward the door, but this time she didn't walk. She ran. She stumbled out of the room, the cold air biting into her face, and bolted down the narrow hallway. The whispers seemed to chase her, curling around her ankles like tendrils, urging her to stop, to look back. But she didn't. She couldn't. When she reached the top of the stairs, she stopped, suddenly breathless. The staircase stretched downward, its darkness at the bottom waiting for her, beckoning her. The house seemed to stretch in unnatural proportions. Shadows curled in the corners of the walls, waiting, watching. Eliza placed a trembling foot on the first step. The wood creaked under her weight, but she barely noticed the sound. The whispers had stopped, and in their place, a deep silence enveloped her. She felt like an intruder in this ancient, cursed place, like the house itself resented her presence. Her pulse quickened again as a sudden gust of cold wind blew through the hallway, pushing her down the stairs. The gust was not natural. There was something almost intentional about it, as if the house were trying to move her, to guide her. She shuddered, but couldn't stop herself from descending further. The door to the study was wide open at the bottom of the stairs, and Eliza's feet carried her toward it, almost as though they had a will of their own. The room beyond the door was pitch black, the walls lined with dark mahogany bookshelves. But there, in the center of the room, a single chair sat in front of the desk. The seat was turned away from her, its backrest facing the empty, shadowy corner. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear, but no one answered. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for any sign of life, anything to assure her that she was not alone in the house. But the room was empty, save for that one chair. The whispers returned then, louder than before, a dissonant melody that echoed through her skull. Her heart slammed in her chest. She moved closer to the chair, her hand reaching for the backrest. A faint glow pulsed in the corner of her eye, and she turned toward it. There, beneath the desk, sat a small, weathered book. The cover was cracked and worn, and the pages looked yellowed with age. As she reached down to pick it up, the temperature in the room dropped again, and the whispers flared into a frenzied chant, almost as though they were urging her to stop, to leave the book alone. But she couldn't resist. She had to know what it was. She had to understand. Her fingers closed around the spine, and as she lifted the book, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, locking her in the dark room. The sound of the lock clicking into place reverberated through her chest like the final nail in a coffin. The book in her hands felt heavier than it should have, as though something was pressing against it, something not of this world. She opened it, flipping through the brittle pages. The handwriting inside was jagged, distorted, like the scrawlings of someone in a frantic, fevered state. The words were incomprehensible, save for a few lines that stood out, written in a language that made her stomach turn. The house hungers. The house calls. The soul of the house is awake, and it waits for the one who dares. The words blurred in her vision. Her mind raced. Who had written this? Her aunt, someone before her, and what did it mean? Suddenly the whispers stopped. A silence so thick, so oppressive, it felt as if the house itself was holding its breath. Eliza stood frozen, the book still in her hands. She felt it then, a sensation, like a dark, unseen presence pressing against her back. It was as if something were standing just behind her, watching, waiting. She spun around. There, in the dark corner of the study, the figure of a woman stood. She was tall and gaunt, her features obscured by shadows. Eliza's breath hitched in her throat, and her body froze in place. The woman's eyes glowed in the darkness, two pools of blackness that seemed to suck in the light around them. Her face was deathly pale, her lips stretched in a thin, unnerving smile. "You shouldn't have come," the woman's voice echoed, though her lips didn't move. The words seemed to reverberate through Eliza's mind as if they were being spoken directly into her soul. Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away. Every instinct in her screamed at her to run, to leave the house, to escape whatever this was. But her feet felt glued to the floor, her body unwilling to obey. The figure's smile widened, showing teeth that were far too sharp, far too many. "You belong to the house now." This continuation of Chapter 1. Deep Chapter 2. The Silent Room. The house had never felt more alive than it did now. After Eliza's accidental discovery in the study, the whispers had stopped, yes, but the silence that had followed was even more suffocating. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. Eliza stood still, the book still clasped in her trembling hands, her eyes locked on the spot where the figure had once stood. But now there was nothing. The corner was empty. The dark figure, if it had ever existed, was gone. But the air around her was heavy with an undeniable presence. The wind outside howled, rattling the old windows. But inside the house, there was no breeze, no sound except for the rapid beat of her own heart. Eliza's chest tightened, and her fingers, cold and clammy, gripped the book harder. She could feel the weight of it, a presence within its pages that seemed to throb with an unnatural energy. She took a slow step backward, but the floor creaked loudly underfoot. Her breath caught. She hadn't meant to disturb the silence, but it had already been broken, hadn't it? By the figure, by the whispers, by the house itself. Clutching the book to her chest like a talisman, Eliza began to retreat toward the door. But the lock clicked once again, as if to mock her escape. The door had been unlocked moments ago, hadn't it? Why was it locked again? And why now, just as she was about to leave? A cold laugh bubbled up from deep inside her, but she swallowed it back. The house, it seemed, was playing its game, and Eliza was caught in its web. Turning on her heel, she walked back to the center of the room, the eerie silence pushing her forward. Her footsteps echoed louder than they should have, bouncing off the walls like a call to something that didn't belong. The book's cover was cracked and faded, and the more Eliza stared at it, the more she felt like it was somehow calling her. The dark words scrawled across the pages made her stomach churn with an unpleasant recognition. Something about them, the twisted sentences, the language that didn't seem entirely human, had a familiarity to them. Eliza forced herself to open the book again. Her eyes scanned the pages, written in that same jagged script. But this time, as her fingers passed over the brittle pages, she noticed something different. The words were shifting. She blinked rapidly, but they were still moving, morphing as though they were alive, twisting and warping before her eyes. The letters blurred together, like ink running down a page. Her heartbeat quickened. What was happening? She had to get out, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt paralyzed, like the house itself was keeping her rooted in place. "Leave!" a voice hissed from somewhere behind her. Eliza spun around, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. But there was no one there. The room was still empty. The dark corners stretched out toward her like the jaws of some unseen beast. Her fingers slid over the pages again, but this time, the words seemed to spell out something different. They weren't just shifting, they were forming sentences. Sentences that spoke directly to her. "You were meant to come here." The blood drained from Eliza's face. Her legs shook beneath her, and she stumbled backward, almost dropping the book. She clutched it tightly, trying to steady herself as she read on. "The house knows your name. The house knows your heart. And soon, it will own you." A chilling gust of wind slammed against the walls, rattling the furniture, and the room seemed to darken further. Eliza's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Was she dreaming? Was she losing her mind? This couldn't be real. She had to leave. She had to get out. But the house wouldn't let her. Before she could take another step toward the door, a soft creaking sound filled the room. Eliza stopped, her body frozen. She knew that sound. It was the sound of the attic door opening. The attic. A part of the house that she had carefully avoided since her arrival. The place where everything had started. The whispers, the unsettling feeling. The feeling that something was watching her from above. With her heart hammering in her chest, Eliza walked toward the doorway, her legs heavy, unwilling. She stepped into the narrow hallway, her breath catching as she looked up at the attic door. The wood was old and warped, a faint line of light leaking through the cracks in the doorframe. The house seemed to breathe in tandem with her. There was no going back now. Eliza approached the door slowly, her hand reaching out to the handle. It felt unnaturally cold beneath her fingertips, like it had been frozen by some unseen force. She turned it. The door creaked open. The attic stairs were steep and narrow, leading up into an all-consuming darkness. The faint light that had slipped through the cracks vanished as the door swung wide, swallowed by the black void above. With a shaky breath, Eliza stepped onto the first stair, her foot meeting the worn wood with a soft groan. The air grew colder with every step she took, the temperature dropping so drastically that she could see her breath misting in the air. The house was alive, she could feel it now, and it was guiding her. Step by step she ascended the stairs, the whispers starting again, low and maddening. They filled her head, their words unintelligible, but their tone filled with dread. You shouldn't have come. Her heart raced as she reached the top. The attic was silent, dead silent, but the air was thick with something she couldn't place. It was almost as if the very space itself had been waiting for her. She stepped into the attic, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The space was cluttered, filled with old, forgotten furniture and boxes covered in a thick layer of dust. And then she saw it. In the far corner, covered by a faded, tattered sheet, was something that caught her eye. A large object, its shape oddly familiar. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat as she made her way toward it. Her hand reached out, trembling, and she pulled the sheet off. There it was, a mirror. But it wasn't any ordinary mirror. The frame was old, ornate, its edges twisted in strange, unnatural patterns. The glass was cracked, dark lines running through it like veins, and the reflection that stared back at her was distorted. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. Her reflection smiled back at her, faintly at first, then wider, until the expression on her face twisted into something cruel, something she couldn't control. The eyes in the mirror, black and hollow, gleamed with a predatory hunger. Eliza stumbled back, a scream rising in her throat, but before she could make a sound, the door behind her slammed shut. Chapter 3. The Hollow Eyes. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the door to the attic slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed in her mind, reverberating through her skull like the tolling of a death knell. Her legs felt heavy, as if the very air in the attic was laden with unseen weight, pushing her to the floor. But it wasn't just the weight of the air that was crushing her. It was the growing, unnatural stillness that had begun to smother every breath she took. The house, alive and patient, seemed to be holding its breath with her. She stood motionless, trembling at the foot of the mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. Or, at least, it wasn't the reflection she knew. The face staring back was a twisted mockery, one that grinned and leered at her with an unnerving expression. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the mirror's surface. The glass was cold, so much colder than it should have been, sending a jolt of icy terror up her arm. Her fingertips barely brushed the surface, before the reflection before her seemed to change, shift. It was as though the glass itself had swallowed her. The distorted version of her image tilted its head and began to smile, wider and wider, until its mouth stretched beyond the natural limits of human anatomy, impossibly wide, as if grinning from ear to ear in a grotesque parody of joy. You shouldn't have come, the figure mouthed silently, its lips parting as if to speak. But the words came not from its mouth, but from within her mind. A voice, chilling and cold, wrapped around her soul. A deep instinct screamed for Eliza to run, but her body betrayed her. She stood frozen in place, her breath shallow, her heart pounding erratically. The figure in the mirror seemed to understand her fear, its eyes narrowing, watching her with the unblinking intensity of a predator studying its prey. "I've been waiting for you," the voice rasped inside her skull, now distinct, as though it was speaking directly into her mind. Eliza's legs finally obeyed her panic and she stumbled back. Her foot caught on the floorboards, sending her tumbling backwards, a soft cry escaping her lips as she collided with the wooden surface beneath her. The world around her seemed to blur. She could no longer tell if she had moved or if the house itself had shifted. The attic felt suddenly alive, a pulsing presence filling the space. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking violently. The mirror seemed to grow darker, its once faded cracks now pulsing with a malevolent energy. The room around her seemed to ripple as though the house itself was breathing. "You are mine," the voice echoed again, louder, clearer this time. Eliza gasped, her head spinning, the reflection in the mirror distorted once again, its mouth opening to speak the words directly to her. She stumbled toward the door, pulling frantically at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Her pulse quickened. The room was closing in on her, and the suffocating weight of the atmosphere pressed down like a thick fog. She turned again to the mirror, knowing she shouldn't, but unable to resist. In the reflection, she no longer saw herself. Instead, she saw a room she didn't recognize. It was dimly lit, with the same old wooden floors, but there were figures inside it. Silhouettes, shapes, standing motionless. She could make out no faces, only shadows. The voice now coming from the mirror was clearer than ever. "Come closer." Before Eliza could react, the mirror began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone, and a heavy pull seemed to emanate from the glass. It was like a dark vortex, trying to drag her in. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, as if the glass had already begun to claim her. Then, with an abrupt crack, the glass shattered. A jagged line of broken shards exploded outward from the center, leaving behind only empty darkness. Eliza gasped, unable to tear her eyes away from the void in the mirror. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. No movement, no sound, just the stillness of the broken mirror. Then, without warning, figures began to appear in the glass, shapes, humanoid, but blurred, as though they had been trapped inside the mirror for years, waiting to escape. They emerged slowly, inch by inch, from the darkened depths. Their faces were blurred, faces Eliza could not make out, but their eyes. Their eyes were hollow, black as voids. The darkness inside their empty sockets seemed to suck the very light from the room. Her mind screamed at her to look away, to run, to do anything other than face the horrors that were emerging from the glass. But she could not. She couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot as the shadows grew clearer, stepping out of the shattered mirror. Their footsteps were silent, but Eliza could feel them. She could feel the weight of their presence, the oppressive force of their being. The first figure reached out, its hand gliding along the floor, as if it were still trapped in the glass. Its fingers stretched out, impossibly long, like twisted, gnarled branches of some nightmarish tree. Eliza couldn't breathe. The room was no longer the attic. She had stepped into something else, something far darker. She realized, too late, that the mirror wasn't a reflection at all. It was a doorway, a portal to a place that existed between worlds, a realm where the dead lingered, forever waiting. "It's time," the voice whispered once again, this time from inside her head, not the mirror. It was all around her. The figures were getting closer now, their movements unnatural. They didn't walk, they slid across the floor, inching closer to her, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Eliza's limbs finally screamed for release, and she bolted toward the door again, her breath ragged and wild. She gripped the handle and wrenched it open, but the room outside had changed. It wasn't the hallway she remembered. It was darker. The walls were breathing, pulsing, as if the house itself was alive, reacting to her fear. And then there was a noise, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor, something that shouldn't be. Eliza turned, and in the flickering dimness of the hall, she saw them. More figures, more shadows, moving slowly toward her. The hallway seemed to stretch out into infinity, an endless corridor of darkness. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Only the deepening silence that filled the house, swallowing her thoughts, drowning her in a sea of terror. The figures grew nearer, their black eyes now glowing faintly in the dark. Eliza's heart raced. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't her imagination. The house itself was trying to claim her, to drag her into the mirror world, into a place of eternal darkness. Her only chance was to escape. But was there any escaping now? End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Unseen Watchers. Eliza could feel the cold air prickling at her skin as she stumbled through the dimly lit corridor. The house, which had once seemed so welcoming and filled with memories of her childhood, now loomed over her like a twisted sentinel, its walls pulsating with a malevolent rhythm that made her bones ache. The mirror. The damn mirror. Every time she closed her eyes, the black-eyed figures flashed before her, emerging from the glass, their hollow stares seared into her mind like scars too deep to ever fade. The house was alive. She knew it now, just as the voice had said. It was alive, and it was waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest as she moved down the hallway, each footstep more hesitant than the last. The soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her seemed louder than ever, the sound carrying through the house like an alarm, waking something that had been dormant for too long. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape. But the longer she lingered in this house, the more she realized that escape might not be possible. The air seemed to thicken around her, pressing in, suffocating her. It was as if the house itself were closing in, pushing her towards some final, inevitable end. A cold sweat trickled down the back of her neck as she turned the corner, only to be met by a door she had never seen before. It was an old wooden door, covered in strange carvings, almost like symbols, but they didn't make sense. The markings were foreign, as if they were meant to be understood by someone, or something, other than her. Her hand hovered over the door's handle. Her instinct screamed at her to turn and run, but her curiosity got the better of her. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening. The mirror had shown her only a fraction of the horrors the house concealed. Now, she was about to uncover something far worse. Taking a shaky breath, she gripped the door handle and turned it. The door creaked open with a sound that sent a chill down her spine. Beyond it lay a room shrouded in darkness. She could make out little more than the vague outline of furniture, its shapes distorted by the shadows. There was something in the air, something thick and heavy, that made her feel as if she were wading through a fog of despair. She stepped inside, the floor beneath her feet cold and unnervingly smooth. The room felt familiar, yet foreign, as if she had been here before in another time, another life. It was a feeling that gnawed at her sanity, tearing at the edges of her mind, making it harder and harder to remember what was real. As she moved deeper into the room, the air grew colder still. A low, guttural sound reached her ears, echoing from somewhere deep within the walls. It was a sound she couldn't quite place, something between a growl and a whisper. The walls seemed to close in on her, their surface shifting as though alive, their very texture changing beneath her fingertips. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise, and then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows, there was a figure. Its form was hunched and twisted, its features hidden in the gloom, but its eyes were glowing. Not with the eerie, hollow blackness of the figures from the mirror, but with a sickly yellow light that seemed to burn through the darkness like fire. The eyes fixated on her, and for a moment, she thought she saw them blink. Eliza froze. Her body refused to move, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, but her body betrayed her. She could not tear her gaze away from the figure. The figure shifted, moving towards her with slow, deliberate steps. Each movement felt like it was stretching the air, warping the space between them. The low, guttural noise deepened, becoming a chant, a rhythm, as if the figure was calling to something beyond the room, something that had been waiting. The closer it came, the more Eliza felt the room change. The temperature dropped even further, her breath now visible in the frigid air. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows twisting into shapes that defied logic, twisting and writhing like something out of a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. The figure stopped just in front of her, its presence overwhelming, pressing in on her from all sides. Eliza's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her back slamming into the cold, unforgiving floor. She scrambled to push herself away, but the figure was upon her now. Its hands, gnarled and clawed, reached out, wrapping around her arm with a grip that felt like iron. It pulled her toward it, dragging her across the floor, and she could feel the icy coldness seep into her very bones. The sound of the chant grew louder, more urgent, and she could swear the floor was beginning to crack beneath her, as though the house itself were breaking apart, pulling her into the abyss. Desperation clawed at her, and with every ounce of strength, she screamed. A scream that tore through her throat, desperate for release. The sound echoed through the room, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw the figure hesitate, but only for a moment. Then, it leaned forward, its yellow eyes now glowing brighter than ever, filling the room with a sickly light. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails on glass. The words sent a chill down her spine, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she understood. The figure wasn't just a part of the house, it was the house, part of the very fabric of the cursed building, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, shadows began to shift, moving like liquid, creeping from the corners of the room. They pooled together, forming shapes, dark, twisted shapes with too many limbs, too many eyes. They advanced slowly, their glowing yellow eyes fixated on her, their bodies twitching as they neared. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as she fought against the figure's grip, but it was useless. The figure's grip was tightening, its claws digging into her skin. She could feel the life being drained from her, her vision dimming, the edges of her consciousness flickering like a dying candle. Then something snapped. Her mind fractured under the weight of it all, under the weight of the curse that had settled over her, over the house, over everything. She felt herself slipping, falling deeper into the void that had opened up before her. The last thing she saw before everything went black were those eyes, the glowing, malevolent eyes. They were everywhere, watching, waiting, and Eliza realized too late that she was never meant to escape. Chapter 5. The Eyes in the Dark. Eliza awoke in darkness, her mind foggy, disoriented. Her limbs felt as if they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. She lay still, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, the air around her suffocating and thick. A faint metallic taste lingered on her tongue, bitter and unnatural. The sensation was wrong, all wrong. The last thing she remembered was the figure's cold grip, its unnervingly calm voice whispering those words in her ear. "You shouldn't have come." A jolt of panic surged through her, but her limbs still wouldn't respond. The oppressive weight of the air around her, thick with malevolence, seemed to press down on her chest. She opened her eyes, and the blackness was absolute. There was nothing, just a void. Not even the faintest hint of light. Her mind scrambled for some semblance of reality. The house, the rooms, the mirror, the grotesque eyes, glowing yellow, and the creatures lurking just beyond her sight. She could still feel their presence, as if the very walls of the house were made of their watching eyes. Slowly, she managed to move her hand, the tips of her fingers brushing against something cold, smooth, and hard. The floor, the ground, she couldn't tell, but it didn't feel right. There was no warmth beneath her, no comforting texture of a familiar surface. The place she had found herself in was nothing like the room she had entered before. This was something else, something deeper, hidden within the bowels of the house. Her breathing grew more rapid, each inhalation a desperate gasp for air. Panic clawed at her chest, and then, there it was again. The low, guttural hum. It vibrated in her skull, in her bones, that same sickening chant that had filled her ears before. But now, it wasn't just a chant. It was a rhythm, a pulse that throbbed in time with her heartbeat, wrapping around her like an unyielding vice. The house was breathing. The walls, the floor, the very foundation was alive. It was a living, breathing organism, a malignant force waiting to swallow her whole. Her body finally responded. She managed to sit up, her head spinning, and reached out to steady herself. She could feel something on the floor, slick and wet. Her hand trembled as she touched it, bringing her fingers to her face. It was blood. Her blood. But where was the wound? She couldn't remember. There was no pain, no open gash. She didn't even feel the bleeding. It was as if her body had been drained, left empty. The darkness began to shift around her, warping, twisting like smoke. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay, like the stench of something long dead, buried for years beneath the earth. And yet it was so close. It was all around her. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something. Something moving in the dark. Not the shadows that flickered in the corner of her vision. Not the shifting walls or the floor that seemed to breathe beneath her, but actual movement. Her heart skipped a beat, her body frozen in terror. There were eyes in the dark, thousands of them. Thousands of hollow black eyes, gleaming like shards of glass in the pitch-black void. For a moment, the room seemed to bend and stretch, twisting at unnatural angles. She closed her eyes, pressing her hands to her temples in a futile attempt to block out the growing dread, the whispers that crawled into her thoughts, seeping into her mind, writhing like worms in her brain. She's awake. She's here. The voice was low, guttural, like the rustling of dead leaves in a forgotten graveyard. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a single voice. It was a collective whisper, a chorus of something ancient and terrible. Eliza's eyes snapped open. In front of her, the eyes grew clearer. Dozens, hundreds, each glowing with that sickly yellow light. They stared at her, not blinking, not moving, just watching. Watching her every breath, her every heartbeat. The feeling of being watched, of being known. It was suffocating. She could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy on her skin, pressing into her mind. A wave of nausea hit her, her stomach lurching violently. She tried to push herself to her feet, but the floor beneath her seemed to give way, as if it were no longer solid. She sank back down, her hands scraping across the wet surface beneath her. It was cold, too cold. The blood on the floor wasn't hers, it couldn't be, but still, it was there. Her eyes flicked around the room, searching for something, anything to break her from this nightmare. And then, as if summoned by her desperation, a voice spoke again, this time not from the walls, but directly behind her. She's here. She must remain, forever. Eliza's heart stopped. She froze, her eyes widening, but there was nothing. No figure, no shape, only the eyes and the voice. It was everywhere. The voice was in the walls, in her head, in her very soul. Suddenly the room seemed to shift again, but this time it wasn't just the walls that were moving. The air around her became thick, liquid, as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing in on her. She could feel it, the slow crawl of something cold, creeping up her spine. The floor began to pulse beneath her, the blood pooling into a thick, sticky mass that threatened to consume her. The walls were alive now too. She could see them shift, bending, pulsing with a life of their own. Eyes blinked in the walls, in the floor, in the very air. The room was full of them, watching, waiting. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled to get up again, but this time she couldn't move. Her body was frozen, held in place by the weight of something unseen, something far more powerful than she could comprehend. Then, the voices rose, louder now. The chant, the pulse, the rhythm of it all, an ancient, unrelenting force. The walls, the air, the very room itself all seemed to close in around her. The eyes blinked, the voices swelled. The house was alive and it was hungry. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest, a cold, jagged feeling as if her very heart were being ripped from her body. Her hands instinctively reached for her chest, but it was too late. She could feel it, the emptiness inside her, the hollow space where her heart had once been. In that moment, the room went silent, and then, from the darkest corner of the room, something began to emerge. A figure, a shape. But it wasn't human. It wasn't anything she had ever seen before. It was a mass of shadow and flesh, a twisting, undulating mass of nightmare. Its eyes gleamed with that sickly yellow light, and Eliza could hear its breath, heavy and labored, like the sound of something far too large trying to fit into a space too small. And then it spoke, its voice deep and resonating, a sound that rumbled through her very bones. Welcome home. And everything went black. Chapter 6. The Endless Night. Eliza's mind floated in the void, a place without shape, a place without time. Her thoughts flickered like dying embers, each one a desperate whisper in the dark, slowly smothered by the suffocating silence that surrounded her. She wasn't sure whether she was awake or asleep, whether she was alive or something else. The last thing she remembered was the cold, sharp pain in her chest, the emptiness where her heart should have been. The house, or whatever it was, had taken something from her, and now she was adrift in an ocean of shadows. She could still hear the voices, though. They weren't loud, but they were always there. Quiet murmurs, a hum of something ancient, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, thudding beneath her feet. She wanted to scream. She wanted to claw her way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing to scream at, nothing to claw at. Only the deep, endless night. Then, as if answering some unspoken call, the shadows began to shift. They stirred like a restless sea, rolling over her, pressing down on her chest, whispering her name. Eliza. The voice was familiar, yet alien, its tone sweet, like honey, yet laced with something far darker, far more dangerous. Her body tensed involuntarily, but she couldn't move. The weight on her chest was unbearable, her breath shallow and labored. She was being crushed by the darkness, suffocated by it. Eliza, the voice repeated, growing closer. You are not alone. You never were. The words rang in her ears, a bitter truth she didn't want to acknowledge. She tried to speak, but her voice was drowned in the thick silence. There was no air to push the sound out. The darkness pressed in harder, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that danced just beyond her vision, always just out of reach. And then she saw it. A flicker, a movement in the corner of her eye. Something was there. It was faint at first, like a shadow passing across the walls. Then it grew clearer, sharper, as though the very darkness was materializing into something solid. The shape was hunched, twisted, like a silhouette made of liquid shadows. Its form was shifting, impossibly long arms dragging behind it, fingers that seemed to stretch and coil like the tendrils of some grotesque plant. Eliza froze, her pulse quickening. The shape was waiting, watching her. The voice came again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a command. Look at me, Eliza. It wasn't her own fear that made her turn her head, but something else. A compulsion, deep and primal. Her body obeyed without question, her neck creaking painfully as she slowly turned toward the source of the voice. And there it was, the creature that had been watching her. Its face, or what passed for a face, was like nothing she had ever seen. Eyes, black as the deepest pit, hollow and empty, stared back at her. Its mouth was a grotesque gash, stretched far too wide, dripping something black and viscous. It opened, then closed again in a slow, deliberate motion, as if savoring her terror. Eliza, it rasped. Do you remember me? Her blood ran cold. The voice. It was his voice. A chill ran down her spine as memories flooded back. The man she had seen in the house, the one whose eyes had been too pale, whose movements had been too quick. He had said something to her before. He had told her she would never leave. But it couldn't be him, could it? The man she had seen was human. This thing in front of her was no longer anything like a man. Eliza, the creature continued, its voice slick with malice. Do you remember when you thought you could escape? A cold laugh echoed in her ears. You never left. You were always here. Eliza's head spun, dizziness rising in her chest like a sickening tide. The shadows around her seemed to multiply, thickening into a dense fog that smothered her vision. And yet, she could still feel them, pressing in on her, watching, waiting. A sharp pain shot through her side and she gasped, her hand instinctively clutching her ribcage. It wasn't real, she told herself. It couldn't be. But the pain was real, sharper than anything she had ever felt. as if her flesh were being pulled from her bones. The creature leaned closer, its foul breath warm against her ear. "You're just another lost soul, Eliza. Another broken piece of this house. And we all know, there's no way out." The words were a weight on her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, but there was no air. There was nothing but darkness, this endless night that had swallowed her whole. The room around her warped again, the walls bending and warping, pulling inward like the jaws of some enormous beast. Her vision blurred, and the shadows twisted, their forms shifting into nightmarish shapes that seemed to crawl out of the very walls. She was no longer sure what was real. In the midst of the chaos, she thought she heard something, a faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against stone. A slow, rhythmic tapping, growing louder with each passing moment. Then she saw it. A hand. A pale, gnarled hand, its fingers unnaturally long, reaching out from the shadows. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every inch it covered. The hand reached toward her, and her heart hammered in her chest. Without thinking, Eliza pushed herself up, her body aching, the pain in her side intensifying. She crawled backward, desperate to get away from the hand, from the eyes, from the monster that loomed in the darkness. But there was nowhere to go. The walls had closed in, the room narrowing to a suffocating tunnel, and ahead of her, the shadows had formed into something even worse, something larger, something that seemed to devour all light in its path. It was as if the house itself had come alive. The hand moved closer, the creature's laughter ringing in her ears. The walls were closing in faster now, and her breath came in frantic, panicked gasps. Her limbs shook with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. She had to get away, but there was no escape. "Don't fight it, Eliza," the creature hissed, its voice like the scrape of nails on stone. "You are mine now." Her heart stopped. There was no way out, no way to fight, no way to live. And then, just as she thought the darkness would consume her, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell. Chapter 6. The Endless Night continued. Eliza's body tumbled through the air, weightless for a moment, before the harsh impact of the ground jolted her back to reality. Her limbs slammed against something cold and hard, her breath forced out of her lungs in a violent gasp. Pain shot up her spine, and for a fleeting moment, she thought her back might be broken. But as her eyes fluttered open, the surrounding darkness pulled her back into its oppressive grip. She tried to move, to push herself up, but the air was thick with a strange, suffocating weight. She was still in the same nightmare, still trapped in the house that twisted and writhed with darkness. The air smelled of damp earth, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Her hands brushed against the cold, uneven floor. It was stone. She could feel the jagged edges of it beneath her fingertips, as though it had been eroded over time by the very nightmares that inhabited this forsaken place. Her heart raced as she pushed herself to sit up, her mind still spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The walls around her were dimly illuminated by an eerie, flickering light, but it was the sort of light that seemed to distort everything it touched, warping reality into something twisted, something alien. Shadows clung to every corner, as though they were alive, watching her every movement. She had fallen. But where was she now? Was this the same room she had just been in? Was it a new one? It was impossible to tell. The house had no logic, no structure, no pattern. It bent time, warped space, and shifted its boundaries with every passing second. A house that wasn't truly a house, merely a prison of torment, a breeding ground for terror. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. Her heart stuttered in her chest, and she gasped, her body frozen in place. What is happening? Her breath hitched as a low growl echoed through the darkened corridor. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't human either. It was something primal, something ancient, resonating deep within the walls of the house, as though it were coming from some unimaginable creature lurking just beyond her reach. Her skin prickled with a chill that cut through her, sharp as ice. Then there was movement. At first it was faint, a whispering shift in the shadows, but as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it. The walls were breathing, The realization hit her like a hammer. The house itself was alive. Her blood ran cold as the walls around her seemed to pulse, to expand and contract like lungs taking a slow, steady breath. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, and the sound of her own breathing seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. "Don't be afraid, Eliza." The voice came again, that low, familiar whisper, curling through the darkness like a snake. It was the same voice she had heard earlier, the one that had haunted her thoughts, the one that had commanded her to look. But this time, it was different. It was closer, much closer. "No, no, no!" Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself up, her hands trembling as she scrambled to her feet. She glanced around the room frantically, but there was no escape. The shadows surrounded her, moving and shifting like a living thing, crawling across the walls and floor. She could feel them inching closer, pressing in on her, suffocating her. Her pulse raced, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. "Look at me, Eliza." The voice, so soft, so enticing, came from behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty, the shadows thickening like an impenetrable fog. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted around the space, looking for the source of the voice. But there was no one there, except for the shadows. "Turn around, Eliza." The command came once again, and this time it felt like it was inside her head, inescapable. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a force that tugged at the very fabric of her will, bending her mind to its whims. She couldn't resist. She couldn't fight it. Slowly, her body obeyed, turning, moving against her will. And then she saw it. The figure stood in the center of the room, tall and cloaked in shadow. It was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something far beyond her understanding. Its shape was distorted, constantly shifting, like a fluid mass of dark tendrils and pale limbs. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but Eliza could feel its gaze burning into her, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You were always meant to be here," the voice whispered, a hissing sound that reverberated through her skull. "You've been chosen. You have always been chosen." Eliza's body shook with terror, her knees buckling as the weight of its words crushed her. She stumbled backward, but the creature moved faster, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, reaching for her with fingers that seemed to claw at the very air itself. "No escape," it hissed, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot run. You cannot hide." Her vision blurred as the creature's figure loomed closer, its movements almost too fast to track, as though it were phasing in and out of reality. The shadows around it pulsed and writhed, reaching toward her, wrapping around her like cold, unyielding hands. She stumbled back again, but this time she couldn't move fast enough. The shadows closed in on her like a swarm of insects, crawling over her skin, suffocating her. She felt them tightening, pulling, as though they were trying to drag her into the very heart of the darkness. "Eliza," the voice murmured, low and dangerous, as if savoring her fear. "We've been waiting for you. You're not just a visitor. You're a part of it now. Forever." Her breath quickened as she fought against the creeping sensation, the coldness that filled her chest. It was as if her body were no longer her own, her skin no longer warm, the blood no longer flowing in her veins. The shadows were inside her now, twisting, tearing at her insides. With a final desperate cry, Eliza tried to break free, but the darkness overwhelmed her. She could feel herself being pulled into it, dragged deeper into the very fabric of the house, swallowed whole by the blackness. And then, nothing. The world fell silent. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Damned. The air was thick, dense with an unseen pressure that weighed down on Eliza's chest. The moment the darkness receded and the pulse of the shadows slowed, a chilling silence fell over her. But it was not a peaceful quiet. No, this silence was not born of calm. It was born of dread. The kind of silence where one could feel the weight of the unseen, the terrible presence lingering in the corners of the room. Eliza tried to move, but the moment she took a step, her feet seemed to sink into the cold ancient floor. She looked down, only to see the stone slabs bending under her weight, as though the very ground itself was alive. breathing with her, mocking her every movement. Her breath quickened as she forced herself to take another step. The shadows were gone now, but the room felt no less oppressive. It felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing with every breath she took. The ceiling, high and far above, felt like it was descending toward her, a heavy, crushing weight of inevitability. The house was not just a place anymore. It was a presence, a force with its own consciousness, its own desires. And it was watching her. She had thought it would end when she lost consciousness, when the shadows swallowed her whole, but instead, she had awoken here. The room was larger now, more expansive, but it was still just as suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of decay, rotting wood, old leather, and something far worse. She could not place it, but it clung to her skin, making her want to tear her clothes from her body just to rid herself of the smell. Her mind screamed at her to move, to escape, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, as though the very stone beneath her was holding her hostage. There were no windows, no doors. She glanced around again, frantically searching for something, anything that could offer her a way out, but the walls remained featureless, flat, empty, nothing. And then she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of her own labored breathing. Eliza. It was the same voice from before. A low, seductive whisper that seemed to curl around her, sliding under her skin like an invisible hand. It was both familiar and alien, warm and cold at once. She stiffened, every muscle in her body tensing. She was not alone. The voice knew her name, but she had no idea where it was coming from. Her eyes darted around, but the room was still empty. No figure, no shape in the darkness. Yet she could feel it. Something watching, something waiting. Eliza, you were always meant to be here, the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. You were never meant to leave. The house has called to you. The house. The words sank in like a stone sinking in water, ripples of panic spreading through her chest. The house had called to her? But why? She didn't understand. She could barely comprehend the very idea of it. The house wasn't just a structure, it was something else, alive, malevolent, and it had been waiting for her to cross some invisible threshold into this hellish nightmare. Suddenly the floor trembled beneath her feet, the walls quivered, and Eliza instinctively clutched her arms to her chest, bracing herself. She heard a low, groaning noise from somewhere far above. The building was shifting again. Shifting. It was as if the house itself had begun to move, to breathe in time with her own desperate gasps. The walls were warping. At first it was subtle, like a slight rippling of water across a still pond. But then it grew more pronounced. The stones seemed to fold, to bend and stretch in unnatural directions. Eliza backed away, her heels scraping against the shifting floor, but every step she took seemed to bring her closer to the center of the room, toward the dark, pulsing heart of the house. A low growl rumbled from somewhere deep inside the walls, a sound too guttural to be human, too monstrous. She froze. From within the shifting walls, something began to emerge. Thin tendrils of dark mist snaked through the cracks, curling into the air like fingers reaching for her. They were long, impossibly thin, but they moved with purpose, stretching across the room toward her. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as one of the tendrils brushed against her arm. It was cold, colder than ice, and as it touched her, she felt something inside her, some fundamental part of her being, tear away. A whisper slid through her mind. "Let go!" "No!" Eliza whispered, shaking her head. "No, I won't!" But it didn't matter. The tendrils were insistent, relentless, pulling her toward them. The room seemed to pulse, the walls closing in tighter, forcing her into the center of the room, where the mist began to form into a shape. A figure. She could see it now, vaguely, its outline shifting in and out of existence like a ghost caught between worlds. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its body a mass of swirling shadows and fog. It had no face, no clear form, but its presence was overwhelming, a cold, empty force that radiated despair. "Eliza," the voice whispered again, this time so close it seemed to vibrate within her very bones. The figure moved closer, and Eliza took an involuntary step back, but she was trapped. The air around her grew impossibly heavy, thick with an ancient malice. And as the shadow reached out for her, she realized that it wasn't just a figure. It was the embodiment of the house itself. The thing that had been waiting for her, watching her, calling her. You want me to stay?" Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper, though the room seemed to amplify it tenfold, making her sound like she was shouting. The shadow paused, its form distorting, writhing like smoke caught in the wind. "I want you to be," it answered, its voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural growl that seemed to echo through her very soul. "I want you to become a part of this place, to stay with me forever." A shudder ran through Eliza's body as her vision blurred, her legs trembling beneath her. There was no escape, no way out. The shadow's hand, if it could even be called that, reached for her, the black tendrils wrapping around her like chains, cold and unyielding. And as it touched her, Eliza felt herself slipping, falling into the darkness, no longer sure where she ended and the house began. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Damned, Part 2. Eliza's heartbeat reverberated in her ears like a drumbeat, steady, rhythmic, and impossible to escape. The shadows had all but swallowed the room, leaving only a vague sense of depth, as though the world around her had become a place in between, suspended in some liminal space. The cold air around her stung like 1,000 tiny needles. But worse than the cold was the suffocating heaviness that weighed upon her chest, constricting her lungs with each desperate breath. Her mind screamed for release, for clarity, but everything felt hazy. The oppressive silence that filled the room was now punctuated by her ragged breaths, and the distorted sounds that echoed from the shadows. It felt like the house itself was alive and watching. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, every whisper that slid like ice down her spine, all seemed to have a pulse of their own, beating in time with her own frantic heart. The tendrils that had touched her were gone now, but their presence lingered, like a phantom sensation. Her skin still burned where they had brushed against her, and a hollow emptiness gnawed at her from the inside. It was a sensation she couldn't place, a hunger that felt like it was not of the body, but of the soul itself. As Eliza slowly began to back away, trying in vain to escape the pull of the shadows, she became aware of something far worse than the whispering void. The house, or whatever it was that controlled it, had started to change. The walls were no longer just walls. They had taken on a disturbing quality, twisting and contorting as though they had a life of their own. The jagged edges of the stone began to bend like the body of a snake, as if it was being manipulated by some unseen hand, and the air grew thicker, more suffocating with each passing moment. "Eliza!" The voice purred again, sending an involuntary shudder through her body. It was as though the sound itself came from every direction at once, echoing from the corners, from the floor, from the ceiling. She couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. "I have been waiting for you." The voice grew darker, twisting into something more sinister. "You should never have left." Her mind began to fragment. No, this couldn't be happening. The voice wasn't real. This was just a nightmare, wasn't it? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But she knew it wasn't. This was real. A shape, a silhouette, began to emerge from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, the outline of something tall, looming and monstrous, stretching impossibly tall against the wavering walls. It was featureless, a shifting amalgamation of blackness, but there was something about it, something that pulled at the very core of her being. "Eliza!" The voice cooed again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a demand. She could feel the pressure around her chest, the weight of the house itself pushing down on her, squeezing the breath from her body. The darkness around her deepened, pressing closer, enveloping her in an inescapable embrace. It wasn't just the walls closing in. It was the very fabric of the house itself, alive and breathing, shifting in unnatural ways. The shape stepped forward, and Eliza could hear the creaking of the floor beneath its weight. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it glided towards her, its form shifting and pulsating like some great, terrible living thing. And then, it stopped, right in front of her. Her mouth went dry as the presence loomed over her. It was closer now, and she could sense its overwhelming power. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but her feet were frozen, her body paralyzed in place. She wanted to scream, but her voice was stolen, choked in her throat by the overwhelming pressure of whatever this thing was. "You have nothing left to fight," the voice said, now vibrating through her very bones. "You are mine, Eliza. The house has claimed you." With every word it spoke, she felt something deeper in her soul being torn away, a piece of herself being consumed by the entity, by the house. It was as if every fiber of her being was being devoured, absorbed into the darkness, and she could do nothing to stop it. She tried to claw at her chest, desperate to hold on to whatever remnants of her soul remained, but it was useless. The cold hands of the house were already inside her, twisting her from the inside out. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, keening sound. It wasn't the voice anymore. It was something worse, something guttural, a sound that sent waves of nausea coursing through Eliza's body. It was the sound of pain, of something ancient and suffering, a creature that had been trapped for centuries. "Eliza!" The voice softened, now almost pleading. "Do you know what happens to those who defy me?" Eliza's vision began to blur, her thoughts slipping like sand through her fingers. The shadow before her leaned closer, its form now more defined. Sharp angles and grotesque, twisted features began to emerge from the darkness, as though the very blackness of the room was pulling at itself, revealing the true nature of the thing before her. It was monstrous, its eyes glowing like burning coals, its mouth twisted into a grin of predatory delight. She screamed then. It wasn't loud, nor was it powerful, but it was desperate, raw, and broken. A sound of someone who knew they were at the end of their rope, who had nowhere left to run. And yet, even as she screamed, the darkness responded. A thick, sticky tendril wrapped around her throat. It was cold, like death itself, and it tightened with cruel precision, choking off her voice. She gasped for air, but her lungs were suffocating in the embrace of the house. And then she felt it, a sensation, cold and sharp like 1,000 needles being driven into her mind. The house was feeding on her. "Eliza, you are nothing," the creature's voice hissed, "and now you will be mine." Her legs gave out from beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, unable to move, unable to escape. The darkness closed in on her, and all she could hear was the maddening hum of the house, the relentless whispering, and the faint distant sound of her own heartbeat. But even as she fell, even as the darkness wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, something in the depths of her mind screamed for survival. Something refused to give in. She couldn't die here, not like this. The darkness laughed. Chapter 8. The Veil Between Worlds. Eliza awoke with a start, her body drenched in cold sweat. Her heart pounded violently against her ribcage, each beat a frantic reminder of the nightmare she had just endured. The darkness still clung to her, a suffocating blanket that refused to let go. She tried to move, to sit up, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish as if submerged in thick, cold water. Panic clawed at her mind as fragmented memories of the chamber, the hollow eyes, the suffocating shadows, the malevolent presence, flashed before her. She was back in the room, but something was different. The air felt lighter, yet no less oppressive. The walls no longer pulsed with dark energy, but an eerie stillness filled the space, broken only by the distant echoes of whispers. She took a shallow breath, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. The sensation of emptiness where her heart should have been still lingered, a hollow ache that gnawed at her from within. Desperation fueled her movements as she struggled to push herself upright, her fingers brushing against the cold stone floor. As she sat up, her eyes adjusted to the dim light that seeped through the cracks in the walls, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The oppressive darkness had receded slightly, revealing more of the chamber's decaying grandeur. Elaborate moldings adorned the walls, intricate patterns now obscured by grime and neglect. Faded tapestries hung crookedly, their once vibrant colors dulled by time and moisture. Eliza's gaze fell upon the mirror again, now lying shattered on the floor. The jagged edges caught the faint light, reflecting shards of darkness that seemed to dance and shimmer with a life of their own. Her reflection stared back at her from the broken glass, a ghostly image twisted by fear and exhaustion. Her eyes, wide with terror, met her own, hollow and searching. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She turned her head slowly, trying to locate the source, but the room remained silent, save for the persistent, low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath her feet. "Eliza!" the voice whispered, barely audible, yet unmistakably present. It was the same voice that had haunted her thoughts, the voice that had tormented her in the shadows. Her skin prickled with goosebumps as she tried to identify the origin, but the darkness obscured everything. She stood up, her legs trembling, and began to explore the room cautiously. Every step she took felt like wading through quicksand, her movements slow and deliberate against the heavy atmosphere. Her fingers traced the intricate designs on the moldings, seeking any clue, any hint of the house's dark secrets. As she approached the center of the room, she noticed a faint glimmer beneath one of the faded tapestries. Curiosity overcame her fear, and she reached out to pull the heavy fabric aside. Behind it, hidden in the shadows, was an old, ornate box. Its surface was carved with symbols she didn't recognize, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift under her touch. With trembling hands, Eliza lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of items, a faded photograph, a rusted key, and a small leather-bound journal. The photograph showed a family, smiling and happy, standing outside the very house she now inhabited. But there was something unsettling about their smiles, something forced, as if they were hiding a dark secret. She picked up the journal, its cover worn and cracked from years of use. As she opened it, the pages were filled with cramped, hurried handwriting. The entries detailed the daily life of a woman named Margaret, the previous occupant of the house. At first, the entries were mundane, recounting chores and weather changes. But as she read further, the tone shifted, growing darker and more frantic. Margaret wrote of strange occurrences, the whispers in the walls, the shadows that moved with a mind of their own, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Her entries became increasingly erratic, describing nights filled with terror and days spent trying to uncover the house's dark history. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, claiming that something malevolent had taken control of the house and that she feared for her life. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine as she read Margaret's last words. "The house is alive. It watches. It feeds on our fear." A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the faint light and plunging her back into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, swirling around her like a vortex of fear. "Eliza!" The voice echoed, this time more commanding. "You are the key." Her mind raced, trying to comprehend the meaning behind Margaret's journal and the house's sinister behavior. The key, what did it mean? Was Margaret referring to the rusty key in the box, or was it something more? Determined to find answers, Eliza retrieved the key, its surface cold and heavy in her hand. She felt an inexplicable urge to follow the voice's instructions, to uncover the truth behind the house's malevolent presence. Taking a deep breath, she began to search the room for any hidden mechanisms or clues that could lead her to the next step. As she examined the walls, she noticed that one of the moldings seemed slightly ajar, a small gap that hinted at a hidden compartment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed against the molding, revealing a concealed latch. With a deep breath, she pulled it, triggering a subtle click that reverberated through the room. The walls slowly began to slide open, revealing a narrow passageway shrouded in darkness. The air that spilled out was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Eliza hesitated for a moment, her fear battling with her need for answers. But the voice called to her, urging her forward, and she knew she had no choice but to follow. She stepped into the passageway, the narrow corridor winding its way deeper into the house's hidden recesses. Her flashlight flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The passage was cramped, the air growing colder with each step, making her shiver uncontrollably. As she navigated the twisting corridor, she felt the house's presence intensify, the air pulsating with dark energy. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, forming fragmented sentences that echoed in her mind. Find the heart. Find the key. Eliza's steps quickened, her anxiety mounting as she pressed deeper into the house's labyrinthine structure. The passageway eventually opened into a large underground chamber, a hidden basement that seemed untouched by time. The room was vast, with stone walls and a high, vaulted ceiling. In the center stood an old ornate pedestal, upon which rested a single gleaming key. Different from the rusty one she had found earlier, this key was silver, intricately designed, and it seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. But the key was not alone. Surrounding the pedestal were numerous mirrors, each framed with the same intricate carvings as the box Eliza had found. The mirrors reflected the chamber, creating an illusion of infinite depth, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Eliza approached the pedestal cautiously, her eyes darting between the mirrors and the key. She reached out to take the silver key, but as her fingers brushed its surface, the mirrors began to distort. The reflections twisted, showing not just the chamber but glimpses of other places, dark forests, desolate landscapes, and shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. The air grew colder, and the whispers morphed into a cacophony of voices, all clamoring for her attention. Take the key. Unlock the truth. She clutched the silver key tightly, feeling its energy resonate with her own. The moment she held it, the room seemed to pulse with life, the stone walls vibrating with dark power. The mirrors reflected not just the chamber, but also her own fears, projecting images of the house's dark history and the souls it had consumed. Eliza's mind struggled to process the visions, each one more horrifying than the last. She saw Margaret, her eyes hollow with terror, running from the darkness that now enveloped the house. She saw families torn apart, their lives shattered by the malevolent force that fed on their fear and despair. The house was a predator, and its prey were the souls of those who dared to reside within its walls. A sudden chill enveloped her, and the whispers grew louder, forming a singular, cohesive voice that echoed in her mind. Unlock the heart, Eliza. Only then can the cycle end. She looked around the chamber, her eyes landing on a large, ornate mirror at the far end. Unlike the others, this mirror was intact, its surface smooth and clear, reflecting her image with unsettling clarity. But as she stared into it, the reflection began to shift, showing not just her face, but the heart of the house, a dark, pulsating core that seemed to throb with malevolent energy. To end this, you must confront the heart of darkness, the voice instructed. Only then can you free yourself and those who came before you. Eliza swallowed hard, her resolve hardening. She knew what she had to do. The house had claimed her, tried to consume her, but she refused to become another lost soul trapped within its walls. She took a deep breath, summoning all her courage, and stepped toward the mirror. As she approached, the room grew colder, the shadows thickening around her. The mirror's surface rippled like liquid darkness, and she could feel the pull of the house urging her to stop, to turn back. But she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to break free. Reaching the mirror, Eliza held the silver key firmly in her hand. She could feel its energy resonating with the darkness within the house, creating a conduit between her and the heart of the entity that controlled it. With a steadying breath, she inserted the key into a small hidden keyhole that had become visible in the center of the mirror's frame. As she turned the key, the mirror began to glow with an intense, blinding light. The darkness in the room recoiled, swirling away from the light, like smoke dispersing in the wind. The mirrors surrounding her shattered, their broken fragments dissolving into the air, while the pedestal crumbled to dust. The chamber seemed to collapse inward, the stone walls giving way as the house's grip on her began to weaken. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence that filled the space with a sense of impending change. Eliza felt a surge of energy coursing through her, the silver key vibrating in her hand as it connected her to the heart of the house. The mirror's surface rippled once more, but this time it revealed a pathway, an ethereal bridge of light that stretched toward the dark core at the center of the house. "Go, Eliza," the voice urged, now a mere whisper carried on the wind. "Face the darkness and reclaim your soul." With determination burning in her eyes, Eliza stepped onto the bridge of light, feeling it solidify beneath her feet. The path ahead was illuminated, casting long shadows that danced at the edges of her vision. The heart of the house awaited, its pulsating darkness a stark contrast to the ethereal light that guided her forward. As she walked, the whispers returned, softer now, more harmonious, almost like a song. They filled her mind with memories, memories of her aunt, of the house's dark past, of the countless souls it had consumed over the years. She felt their presence, not as malevolent beings, but as lost, tormented spirits yearning for release. The pathway led her to a grand chamber, the very heart of the house. At its center stood a towering pillar of darkness, swirling and writhing like a living entity. It pulsed with an ominous energy, radiating a sense of infinite despair. The air around it was thick with the scent of decay and fear, making it hard to breathe. Eliza approached the pillar, the silver key glowing brightly in her hand. She could feel the pull of the darkness, its tendrils reaching out to ensnare her, but the light of the key held it at bay. She stood before the pillar, gazing into the abyss that threatened to consume her. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the chamber. "What do you want from me?" The darkness responded with a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through her very soul. "We are eternal. We are bound to this house, to its darkness. Your fear sustains us. Your despair feeds us." Eliza's eyes burned with determination. "I refuse to let you win. I won't let you take my soul, or the souls of those you have consumed." A flicker of something, anger perhaps, passed through the darkness. "You cannot defeat us, Eliza. We are a part of this house, and this house is a part of us. Together, we are eternal." She tightened her grip on the silver key, feeling its warmth against her skin. "Then let me break that bond. Let me free both myself and you from this endless cycle of fear and despair." A sinister laugh echoed through the chamber, and the darkness began to swirl more violently, tendrils of blackness snaking toward her from every direction. "You think you can change what has been set in motion? You think a mere key can undo centuries of darkness?" Eliza stood her ground, her eyes locked on the heart of the house. "I have to try. I have to believe that there's a way to end this." The darkness hesitated, its form wavering as if caught in a moment of uncertainty. "Very well," it whispered, the voice laced with a hint of reluctant admiration. "But know this, if you fail, you will become one of us, forever bound to the house, forever trapped in darkness." She nodded, understanding the gravity of her task. "I accept the risk. I will do whatever it takes to end this." With a surge of energy, Eliza thrust the silver key toward the heart of the house. The key flared with a brilliant light, clashing against the darkness in a spectacular explosion of energy. The chamber was filled with light and shadow, the two forces battling for dominance. The whispers reached a crescendo, voices intertwining in a chaotic symphony of fear and desperation. But amidst the chaos, Eliza focused on the task at hand. Channeling all her willpower into the key, she felt the connection deepen. The key acting as a bridge between her and the darkness, drawing out the essence of the house's malevolence. The pillar of darkness began to fracture, cracks forming across its surface as the light from the key seared through the shadows. The voices grew louder, more frantic, as if the darkness was struggling to hold on to its existence. Eliza pressed forward, her determination unwavering. "End this," she commanded, her voice steady despite the turmoil around her. "Let us both be free." A blinding flash enveloped the chamber, and Eliza felt a surge of energy coursing through her body. The darkness screamed, a sound of pure anguish and rage, as the bond between her and the house began to dissolve. The shadows recoiled, the tendrils of darkness dissipating into the ether, carried away by the force of her will. As the light intensified, Eliza felt the weight of the house lift from her shoulders. The oppressive presence that had held her captive for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace she had never known. The chamber, once a place of torment, now felt serene, the dark pillar reduced to a mere shadow. With one final push, Eliza released the silver key, watching as it floated upward, its glow diminishing until it was nothing more than a faint shimmer in the air. The chamber was silent once more, the darkness fully banished, leaving behind only the remnants of a battle fought and won. Eliza collapsed to her knees, exhaustion overwhelming her. She looked around the chamber, now bathed in soft ambient light, and felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The house, once a prison of darkness and fear, now felt like a sanctuary, the malevolent presence eradicated by her courage and determination. As she stood up, she felt a gentle warmth enveloping her, a comforting embrace that was in stark contrast to the cold terror she had endured. The voices of the lost souls, once tormented by fear, now whispered words of gratitude and farewell, their essence finally freed from the house's grip. "Thank you, Eliza," the voices murmured, their tones filled with peace. "You have set us free." Tears welled in her eyes as she took a deep breath, savoring the newfound serenity. She had faced the darkness, confronted her deepest fears, and emerged victorious. The house, now devoid of its malevolent energy, felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to find peace. As Eliza walked out of the chamber and back into the main hall, the house seemed to respond with a silent acknowledgement, the once oppressive walls now exuding a sense of calm and hope. She made her way through the corridors, each step lighter than the last, the house transformed from a place of horror to a home of solace. The sun began to rise outside, its golden rays streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over the once dark and foreboding mansion. Eliza stood at the entrance, taking one last look at the house that had become both her prison and her savior. She knew that the scars of her ordeal would remain, but she also knew that she had the strength to overcome them. With a final lingering glance, she turned and walked away, leaving behind the shadows of the past and embracing the promise of a brighter future. Chapter 8. The Veil Between Worlds. Extended continuation. As Eliza walked away from the grand chamber, each step felt like shedding a layer of her former self. The oppressive darkness that had once consumed her was now a distant memory, replaced by the warm embrace of dawn's first light. The house, now transformed, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its malevolent energy dissipating into the morning air. She paused at the entrance, her eyes lingering on the mansion one last time. The ivy that once seemed to clutch at the walls with a desperate tenacity now swayed gently in the breeze, no longer a sign of the house's hidden malevolence, but rather a symbol of renewal and hope. The once shattered mirrors had been replaced by clear, reflective surfaces that captured the beauty of the new day, reflecting her own image, stronger, more determined, and free from the fear that had once held her captive. Eliza took a deep breath, the fresh morning air filling her lungs with a sense of liberation. She had faced the darkness within herself and the house, and in doing so, had broken the chains that bound her. The echoes of the damned were silenced, their spirits finally at peace, their torment ending with her victory. As she turned to leave, a sense of accomplishment and peace settled over her. The journey had been long and fraught with fear, but she had emerged stronger, having conquered the very essence of her nightmares. The house, once a place of terror, had become a symbol of her resilience and strength. She walked down the winding road that led away from the mansion, the sunlight dancing on the leaves of the trees that bordered her path. The forest, once dark and foreboding, now appeared vibrant and alive, teeming with the promise of new beginnings. Birds chirped merrily, their songs a stark contrast to the haunting whispers that had plagued her in the darkness. As she reached the edge of the forest, Eliza paused, looking back one final time. The house stood majestic and serene, a beacon of hope and redemption. She felt a pang of gratitude for the strength she had found within herself, the courage that had guided her through the darkest of times. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "Thank you for letting me free." With a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken, Eliza continued her journey, leaving behind the shadows of the past and embracing the promise of a brighter future. The House of Whispers, now silent and peaceful, remained a testament to her victory, a reminder that even in the depths of darkness, light and hope could prevail. End of Expanded. Chapter 8. The summary of Chapter 8. The Veil Between Worlds. In this chapter, Eliza confronts the heart of the house's malevolent presence. Armed with the silver key, she unlocks the chamber where the dark entity resides. The battle between light and darkness ensues, symbolizing her struggle against fear and despair. Through sheer determination and courage, Eliza manages to dismantle the entity's power, freeing herself and the souls trapped within the house. The mansion transforms from a place of horror to a sanctuary, symbolizing Eliza's personal growth and triumph over her deepest fears. Chapter 9. The Phantom Echoes. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, a pale, sickly orb casting its light upon the desolate landscape below. The wind stirred the trees, whispering secrets through the rustling leaves, but there was something unnatural in the air tonight, an unnatural stillness, as though even the earth itself was holding its breath, afraid to move, afraid to disturb the restless spirits that lingered just beyond the veil of the living. In the village, the air tasted of decay, thick and suffocating. The buildings, long abandoned, stood like hollow sentinels in the distance, their windows black and empty, as though they, too, had turned their eyes away from the nightmare unfolding. The once vibrant colors of the houses had faded, washed out by time and neglect, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of what had been. There was a house, an old house at the end of the street. It was the sort of house that whispered its own secrets to those who dared approach it, as if the very walls were alive, aware of the horrors they had witnessed. And tonight, those walls were waiting again. Inside the house, a figure moved silently, as if floating through the air rather than walking. His steps left no mark on the dust-covered floor. His name had once been Richard, but that name, along with his life, had long since been forgotten. He was something else now, something that no longer had a place in the world of the living. Richard's eyes, if they could even be called eyes anymore, glowed with a faint otherworldly light. His skin was pale, a sickly grey, as though all the life had been drained from him. His body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if he were caught between two worlds, tethered to neither. A faint echo of his former self lingered, but it was fading with each passing second. The house creaked around him, the sound of it echoing like a mournful sigh. A shadow flitted past the corner of his vision, something almost human in form but twisted and wrong. Richard turned, his gaze following the movement, his senses heightened. But nothing was there, just the emptiness, the hollow, unsettling silence that clung to the house like a shroud. His fingers twitched, his mind grasping at memories that refused to come into focus. He had once known this place, once called it home. There had been laughter here, voices that filled the rooms with warmth. But that was before the darkness had come, creeping in like a slow tide, swallowing everything whole. Richard remembered the night it had started, the night the first scream had echoed through the house. He had been a different person then, a man with a life, a family, and a future. The man he had been had felt the first stirrings of dread that evening, as the air had turned cold and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. His wife, Mary, had been the first to hear it, the whispering from the walls. It had sounded like a voice, low and soft, but unmistakable, a voice that didn't belong. It had promised things too terrible to comprehend. Richard had dismissed it, of course, but Mary, she had known. She had always known that something was wrong with this house. The house had been built on cursed ground, she said, ground that had been soaked in blood long before they had ever arrived. And then there had been the dreams. They had come to Richard first, those dreams of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. His dreams had turned to nightmares, and in those nightmares he had seen himself, no longer human, but something else. In those moments, Richard had felt it, the pull, the call of something ancient, something that had existed long before him, long before this house was even built. It had been waiting, watching, biding its time, and it had found him. The house had known too. It had been alive, aware, feeding off the fear that had seeped into its bones. And now, Richard could feel it once again. The pressure in the air, the weight of something watching him, waiting. But this time, it was different. This time, there was no escape. Richard took a step forward, and the floor beneath him groaned in protest. He moved toward the room at the end of the hall, the room that had once been Mary's sanctuary, but now it was nothing more than a tomb. The door creaked open on its own, as though it had been waiting for him. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. In the center of the room, on the bed, was a figure. At first, it appeared to be Mary, her body still and pale, her eyes closed as though she were merely sleeping. But as Richard drew closer, his heart pounding in his chest, he saw the truth. Mary's body had long since decayed, her flesh rotting away to the point of unrecognizability. Her once beautiful face had been twisted into a grotesque mask of pain and horror, and yet, even in death, her eyes were open, wide, unblinking, and they fixed themselves on Richard with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Her lips parted, but it was not her voice that emerged. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said, a voice that was both hers and not hers. It was cold, filled with malice. "It's too late. The house, it will never let you leave." Richard stepped back, his body trembling, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen, caught in the gaze of the thing that had once been his wife. "Mary," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What happened? What is this?" The figure on the bed tilted its head, and for a brief moment, Richard thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by something darker, something much older. "The house feeds," the voice whispered. "It always has. It has fed on your fear, on your suffering. It has taken everything you were, and now it will take you too." Richard tried to turn away, to flee, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, the shadows thickening, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then from the corner of his eye, he saw it, an outline in the darkness, tall and thin, with a face obscured by shadow. It was moving toward him, slowly, deliberately. No, not a face, Richard realized. Not a face at all. It was a mask of pure darkness, a void where features should have been. And it was coming for him. He opened his mouth to scream, but the words caught in his throat. The thing was upon him now, its presence overwhelming. It was not just in the room with him, it was inside him. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And as he fell to his knees, the last remnants of his humanity slipping away, Richard understood. The house had never wanted him to leave. It had never wanted any of them to leave. It was never over. Not for anyone, not even for the dead. Chapter 10. The House's Breath. The walls of the house creaked and groaned as if they too were alive. There was no sound in the air but the oppressive pulse of the building's breath, deep, resonant and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through the floorboards. The night had grown unbearably heavy. A storm brewed in the distance, thick black clouds swirling overhead. Yet the air inside the house was still, suffocating, as though it knew of the events yet to unfold. The moon, high in the sky, barely shone through the swarming clouds. There was no light, only shadows. Sharp, angular shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally across the floor, converging on the center of the hallway. The walls closed in, narrow as if they were compressing, pushing against the very marrow of the house itself. Sarah had long since abandoned the thought of escape. The door to the house, once wide and inviting, was now just a distant memory, an illusion from a past where things still made sense, when the world outside the house still felt like something she could return to. The windows were darkened, the curtains drawn tight as though to keep the light away, to keep the house from seeing the outside world. And then there was the whisper, always the whisper. It was a voice she'd heard, or thought she had heard, the moment she stepped into this place, long before the house had swallowed her whole. It wasn't one voice. No, it was a chorus of them, all murmuring at once, just beneath the surface of the wind, just beyond the edge of her hearing. It was a cold voice, the kind of voice that made her skin crawl, a voice that spoke of things that shouldn't be. The dead, the forsaken, the forgotten, they lived here now. With each passing moment, she felt the weight of their presence press against her, as if the walls themselves were closing in, narrowing the space between her and them. "I am here," the voice murmured in her ear. echoing from the very walls themselves. The sound of it, it wasn't a voice so much as it was a presence. It was as though the house itself had begun speaking through the cracks in the floorboards, the uneven timbers, the peeling wallpaper. The voice was familiar, but at the same time, utterly alien. It was something deep within her mind that she couldn't name. Something like an old memory, or a forgotten nightmare. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. The floor beneath her creaked as if something heavy had shifted above her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the source of the sound, toward the spiral staircase that loomed at the far end of the corridor. There was someone there, or rather, something. The figure was tall, dark, indistinct in the dim light, but it was moving toward her. It moved with purpose, the floorboards groaning beneath its weight. But when she blinked, it was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the air. Her stomach twisted in horror. The house seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy now, the atmosphere thickening, closing in around her like a vice. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The house knew her. The house had always known her. Her mind reeled as the whispered voices began to grow louder, blending into a single cacophony of sounds. There was no escaping them, no escaping this place. She could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, coming from above. She wasn't sure how long they had been there. She hadn't heard them before, not like this. Now they were unmistakable. Heavy, slow steps. Someone, or something, was coming down the stairs. Her breath quickened as she moved toward the staircase. Her legs trembled, but her feet carried her forward against her will. The house wanted her to move. The house called to her, pulling her like a magnet, drawing her toward the inevitable. The stairs creaked under the weight of the unseen figure's approach, each step heavy with the knowledge that something was watching her from above. Her pulse quickened, every muscle in her body screaming for her to turn and flee. But she couldn't. The house held her, entranced in its rhythm. She reached the base of the staircase. Her hand trembled as it hovered above the banister, uncertain of whether it was her own will guiding her, or if the house was moving her hand for her. And then, she saw it, the shadow at the top of the stairs. It was a silhouette, dark and tall, yet too shapeless to be human. Its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, thin, elongated like the limbs of a spider, but there was no face. Only darkness, a swirling, shifting blackness, where eyes should have been, where a face should have been. The whispering reached a crescendo, 1,000 voices blending together into one. The figure stood there, still as stone, its form flickering, like the remnants of a fading memory. It wasn't just a figure. It was a presence, an idea, a thing that had never been alive but had always existed in the gaps between reality and the things unseen. "Why do you fight it?" the voice whispered again, this time louder, clear. "It was always meant to be this way." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to take a step forward. She had to understand. She had to know what it wanted from her, what the house wanted from her. The house had made its demands clear. The thing on the stairs had waited for her, watched her. It knew her name. It knew everything about her. She had been drawn here by the house, she realized now. It wasn't a mere coincidence. Her family had never been safe. This house had always been her home, long before her first steps, long before her memories began. It had been built on blood, blood spilled by something far older than she could comprehend. Sarah took another step, the sound of her feet on the steps the only sound in the silence that now enveloped her. And then, the figure moved. It was like the moment before an earthquake, the air thickening, the space between them stretching. It didn't walk, didn't crawl. It was there, then it wasn't. The shadow flickered, expanding, twisting toward her, and before she could scream, it was upon her. The darkness surrounded her, and the world fell away. And in that moment, Sarah understood. The house wasn't just alive. It was something ancient, something unknowable, something that fed on more than just the living. It fed on memory, on emotion, on the very essence of the soul. It had been waiting for her, for someone to come who would understand. And now she was part of it, forever. The end. A quiet fall into darkness. The house no longer creaked in protest, nor did it whisper. The shadows that once stretched across the walls and floor like dark fingers now seemed to linger in perfect stillness, as if they, too, had found peace in the final silence. Sarah stood, or rather, she existed, somewhere between the edges of time and memory, no longer a visitor, but something deeper, more intrinsic, a part of the very soul of the house. She had become one with it, drawn into its ancient, inescapable rhythm. There was no longer a need for breath, for hunger, for sleep. There was only the pull of the house, the quiet acceptance of the fate she had fought so hard to resist. The faces of the past lingered around her, fragments of voices, forgotten dreams, and the faintest traces of lives once lived. The other souls who had been claimed by the house before her had become part of its ever-expanding presence, their memories woven into the fabric of the walls, absorbed into the floorboards, each one a story, a piece of the puzzle. She wasn't alone, not really. The house kept them close, its fingers entwined with the very essence of their being. Outside, the storm raged on, the winds howling against the windows, but inside, there was only quiet. There was nothing left but the constant, steady breath of the house that had waited for her, that had drawn her to its depths. And now, she was its own, bound by an ancient promise that no one could undo. The shadow at the top of the stairs had been only the beginning. It had led her here, to this moment, to the realization that the house was no ordinary place. It was a living, breathing entity, older than time itself, fed by the darkness of human emotions, by memories both forgotten and cherished. It knew her. It knew them all. It always had. As Sarah's senses dulled, as her awareness of her own physical form began to slip away, she could feel it, the house's embrace, gentle and inevitable. It was as though she had never left, as though she had always belonged. The souls of the past, her own fading memories, were now part of the house's eternal pulse. And then, like a final breath, a whisper escaped the walls. Now you understand. It was the voice of the house itself, a voice that had once been a whisper, now clear and full of knowing. Sarah could feel the weight of its words pressing against her consciousness, sinking into her being, filling the spaces where fear once resided. There was no more room for fear, no more need for escape. There was only acceptance, only an eternal dance between the living and the dead. Her body no longer mattered, nor did her past. There was only the house, its walls, its dark embrace, its endless hunger. As the moonlight finally broke through the storm clouds, spilling a thin shaft of pale light into the hallway, Sarah, no longer Sarah, stood at the threshold of the door, gazing into the endless night. And in that moment, the house was at peace. The breath of the house slowed, its rhythmic pulse growing faint, as though it too was settling into an eternal rest. But the silence would never be complete. For those who came after would hear the whispering. They would feel the pull, the quiet beckoning, just as Sarah had. And they would come, just as the house had always known.